If Miranda Hillard never discovered that Mrs. Doubtfire was actually Daniel in disguise, so Miranda never finds out that her housekeeper is actually her ex-husband. So let's say that Mrs. Doubtfire refuses to go to Miranda's birthday celebration dinner at Bridget's restaurant. And so Mrs. Doubtfire does not go with the family, and instead, Daniel Hillard goes to meet with Mr. Lundy at Bridget's restaurant. And Daniel would, of course, be very upset to see his family having dinner with Stuart Dunmeyer, Stu. But at the same time, Daniel would try to ignore that and focus on the meeting with Mr. Lundy because Daniel has to get the job. Now, Miranda would not be very happy to see Daniel at the restaurant, but of course, the three kids, would be so happy to see their dad, Daniel, at the restaurant. And Stu would not be happy to see Daniel either. So this would probably make Stuart and Miranda take things a little more slowly because they are in the presence of the kid's father. Now, Daniel manages to charm Mr. Lundy, and Daniel gets the job. He is very successful in that interview. And Daniel starts working for Mr. Lundy. Daniel has a very successful show. And of course, he probably wouldn't be starring as Mrs. Doubtfire in this case because he would have never been discovered. But Daniel has such a highly rated, successful show with Mr. Lundy that Mr. Lundy is very proud of Daniel, and Daniel is getting paid very well, and he has a very steady, well-paced job, and Daniel can clearly keep it together well, and he's clearly very fit and able to be a good parent to the kids. So Mrs. Sellner and the courts, they find Daniel to be very favorable. And Miranda, seeing as how Daniel has become very responsible and very good at keeping a stable lifestyle, Miranda would also be moved a little bit to reconsider Daniel. And what she would do from there is she might think that it would be good to have Daniel around the kids more often, because she also saw how well organized Daniel's apartment was and how well he was cooking, and she was impressed with him as well, very proud of him. So from there, but now with Daniel spending so much time on the show, Mrs. Doubtfire would probably retire. And by that, what would happen is Mrs. Doubtfire would tell Miranda that she's retiring and that she has to go back to England or something. So Mrs. Doubtfire's alibi is that Mrs. Doubtfire is returning, moving back home to England. And Miranda would be devastated, and so would the youngest kid, Natalie or whatever her name was. They'd be devastated, but of course, Chris and Liddy, the two older kids, they would understand what's going on, because they know Mrs. Doubtfire is actually Daniel. And so Mrs. Doubtfire retires, and but before Mrs. Doubtfire retires, Mrs. Doubtfire has a long, serious conversation with Miranda, and Mrs. Doubtfire manages to persuade or move Miranda in the right direction, rather, and Miranda maybe decides to give Daniel a little bit of a chance with the kids. So maybe she starts allowing Daniel to see the kids more often, and gradually it turns into a regular thing where Daniel is watching over the kids after school while Miranda is at work. So Daniel is spending a ton of time with his kids, just as much as he would before everything happened. So from there, Daniel and the kids get to spend just as much time together as the kids spend with Miranda, and everyone lives happily ever after, and there is no shock of discovering that Mrs. Doubtfire was Daniel in disguise, and Miranda is not angry at Daniel, and or any more angry at Daniel, and Miranda does not have that crazy moment. So everything goes more smoothly, even though the movie had a happy ending. If Mrs. Doubtfire had never been discovered, then it would have had a more happy ending, perhaps, or maybe equally happy.